Today, I have a very interesting episode for you. Today, we're going to be talking about Richard the Lionheart's queen, whose name I don't really know how to pronounce, but this is Just Feudal Things, episode 11, with a special guest who is an expert on the queen and wife of Richard the Lionheart. Just Feudal Things is a conversational podcast about medieval history with subject matter experts and enthusiasts. If you'd like to follow along with all of my medieval content, you can check out my Substack link in the description, as well as my X account, also in the description. And I will be releasing shortly a medieval-themed deck of playing cards that you'll be able to purchase in order to support the work that I am doing to bring you more medieval history, conversations with historians, subject matter experts, and regular content to inspire you to enjoy and learn medieval history. And in case you missed it, the last episode was an over 3-hour giga episode to celebrate the 10th episode on the Fourth Crusade. And although they're not set in stone yet, I will have some future episodes coming up on the First Crusade and the Albigensian Crusade, and a couple other subjects that I'm still looking to put together. Today's guest is Dr. Gabby Storey. She's a historian of monarchy and sexuality, whose first book, a biography of Berengaria of Navarre, Queen of England and wife of Richard I, was published in 2024. She's even been a historical consultant on documentaries for Channel 4 in the UK. More details on her current research can be found via her website, or you can follow her on Instagram and Blue Sky. The links to all of those will be in the description below. Okay, so the first question that I have for you is perhaps the most important. How do you say her name?
So I say Berengaria. Other people would say Berengaria. I think either's fine, really. But she's a woman of really many names in sense of she's Berenguela because she's Spanish, or what we'd call Spain in modern day parlance. Berengier for the French. So she's a woman who's, got an unfamiliar name and no one's quite sure what's the best way to say it. But I would say Berengaria. I think that's the way to go with it.
Berengaria, okay.
Yeah.
I'll try to keep on that one. I think my natural tendency was to say Berengaria.
Yeah.
I think that's how I said it in my head. So Berengaria, I'll try to get that one. Okay, so I'm mostly familiar with her story as it relates to Richard the Lionheart, but she obviously has a whole story, which we'll get into here prior to Richard, and a whole story after Richard. And I think, it's let's start with that. She ends up marrying Richard as she is on crusade. And I did just a little bit of research in preparation from what I have handy here. And so I was reading through a little bit of John Gillingham's book on Richard, just to see what he had put together on Berengaria. And it seems like it was perhaps a strategic alliance, maybe to sort of secure Richard's southwestern border as he's kind of on crusade. And it seems like maybe Eleanor made the arrangements. But you probably know much more than I have briefly read, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that all came to be, and then we can talk a little bit about their marriage.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for Richard, it is very much a strategic alliance, as you've said from Gillingham. It's very much about protecting Aquitaine whilst he goes on crusade. So Richard knows he's going to go on crusade before he even becomes king, really. And this is his priority number one once he becomes king in 1189. So there's a slight fly in the ointment here in that Richard's actually already engaged to Alice, the sister of the King of France. So it's a little bit tricky for him to get out of this because he's really going to risk upsetting his major ally at this point. Richard and Philip Augustus are meant to be going on crusade together as brothers in arms and so forth. So Richard breaking off this betrothal to Alice and choosing Berengaria instead is really going to risk rocking the boat. But Navarre is important. Like we said, it can protect Aquitaine's borders. Sancho can provide soldiers. He can provide support. militarily as well as politically. So it looks to be something that's going to be a bit more stable, a bit more reliable than France could ever be. I mean, anyone who knows kind of medieval history or even early modern history knows how much England and France are at war with one another. So with regards to how much Eleanor's involved, it's more open to interpretation. We don't know that she's definitely the one who picks Berengaria. We do know that she is the person who goes to fetch Berengaria from Navarre, and they make the journey overland because Richard has already set off on crusade at this point in 1191. So it's Eleanor who goes to Navarre, fetches Berengaria. They travel across Western Europe, through Italy and down to Sicily, which is where Berengaria then meets Richard. As you know, a little bit of kind of romantic notions about this idea that Richard had met Berengaria when he was younger and maybe he loved her and so on. But I think that's more something for the poets and the troubadours of the time rather than any basis in reality.
And so one of the very legitimate criticisms of Richard is that he failed to have an heir, which is ultimately how there ends up to be the fracas between Arthur of Brittany and John and that whole debacle. So what's sort of the theory behind that? Because Richard did actually recognize another son, I believe, Philip of Cognac, an illegitimate son. So what's sort of the, I guess, character of their marriage? How do we sort of look at that and look into sort of the, inability to have an heir?
Yeah, I mean, ironically, this is something I've literally just been writing about before I came to have this conversation. So it's a really interesting discussion because we know Richard has a child. So does that disprove the rumours around his sexuality, which of course has been a really vibrant part of the discussion around, was Richard gay in modern terms? Was he perhaps bisexual? Why doesn't he have children with Berengaria? It seems like he's not infertile. So yeah, rumours about Richard's sexuality have really abounded. Whether perhaps Berengaria was infertile, I mean, she chooses not to remarry, so is there an element of that potentially, that she's infertile and she knows it? But also, they don't actually spend a lot of time together. They're together for the first 2 years of their marriage on crusade. They decide to take separate journeys back, which is when Richard gets captured. And for what we know, Berengaria spends most of her remaining time as Queen of England actually on the Angevin heartland in France. So what we'd call modern day France. And we don't 100% know if they actually meet again. So it's not really a relationship we can call personally successful because they just don't seem to want to spend time with each other. And even if they don't like each other that much, that idea of having an heir is really important because it's what you've got to do. You've got to make sure you've got someone to succeed.
Yeah, it seems like one of the, I guess, big mysteries is that sort of, how that is all playing out. Because that, I've covered a lot. There's a lot of things I feel like Richard is unduly criticized for, but not leaving an heir seems to be one of the main legitimate criticisms that I would certainly agree with.
Yeah, because I know you've discussed Richard's brother John recently on the podcast, and in terms of his reputation and what he does. And in my opinion, and I know there's other Richard scholars who may disagree with me, in my opinion, he's very much more of a fighter than a ruler. I don't think he pays enough attention to England in particular. But he has Eleanor of Aquitaine, his mother, who he can depend upon, and he has a Regency Council who can take care of things whilst he's away. So is he perhaps trying to make the best of a bad situation in terms of Philip Augustus, the King of France, is a really mighty, powerful king, and he's very strong militarily. He's very good at winning battles, and Richard can't quite do enough, and John certainly can't do enough to stabilise the realm against him. So yes, I think there are definitely aspects of Richard's reign we can criticise, including that failure. But this is also part of those larger dynamics of medieval Europe where you do just have warfare. You do have countries fighting against one another for territories, for land, for prestige. And they're just part of that overall political dynamic of the 12th and 13th centuries.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think sort of maybe gets lost in the sauce of some of the criticisms of him when people say stuff like, well, he wasn't in England, but it's like, well, but he was already pledged to go on crusade. He had to get back lands when he got back. He was captured. I mean, you can't really fault a guy for not being around if he gets kidnapped. That's sort of a weird criticism, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think as well the fact, so for those who aren't completely familiar with the period, we call this, the Angevin Kings because they come from the county of Anjou in France. And they do rarely see themselves still as very much Angevins. They see themselves as concerned with their territories in France. England is a very nice addition. And indeed, it was the focus for Empress Matilda when she passed it on to her son, Henry II, who was the first of the Angevin kings. But we do see that shift in John's reign where they've gone from being kings from the Angevin kings to actually kings of England in full. Like, England needs to be ruled, it needs to be focused on. So yeah, Richard's does see England for its worth, but does have, as you say, all these other territories to focus on as well, which kind of pull him to different pieces. And if England doesn't need attention because there's not a civil war, because there's not conflict in the same way there's been in his father's reign, in the anarchy leading up to Henry II's reign, and then happens in John, perhaps it is okay to leave it alone.
And I think this is also another thing that should be mentioned is the reason that Richard was trying to get out of his engagement to Philip's, that's King Philip of France, his sister, is because she had been staying, betrothed to Richard at Henry's court, and Henry had made her his mistress, as I understand. I don't believe this is controversial, right? This is that's a pretty standard, well-known thing. And so he was trying to get out. He didn't want to marry his father's mistress, basically.
It's a bit of a kind of urban legend, I would say, in terms of I don't think you can conclusively prove that she was his mistress. So I think it is something that has stuck in many of the biographies and that is kind of assumed. There's a fantastic French historian who's working on a biography of Alice at the present, and she's kind of spoken about the fact that Alice has kind of suffered so much in her reputation and historical memory because she's seen as a mistress and then she's discarded by Richard, and people just aren't focused on her afterwards. So I think for some of the chroniclers, it gives Richard a legitimate reason to break off the engagement because, she's sullied goods for want of a better term. But I don't think we can definitely prove it in the same way we can prove, for example, Rosamond Clifford, who's another one of Henry II's kind of big mistresses.
Well, and I should say I'd view that as no fault of Alice's. But so what would the theory then be that if Richard wants to break off the engagement with Alice, let's say if that's incorrect, then what would the theory be of why he would want to do that?
I think because he doesn't view her as useful anymore. This alliance with France had been this agreement that Richard would marry Alice, took place in 1169. We're now 20 years later when Richard comes to the throne, and it's not worthwhile anymore. And Alice is sent to England to Henry II's court at a very young age. She's raised there. She's raised expecting to be married to a future king. But for Richard, he doesn't see it as a worthwhile move. He's got other priorities, as we mentioned, the Crusades, obviously one of the big ones. But he doesn't think he can trust Philip. He doesn't think he can trust the King of France, and therefore why is he going to tie himself into a marital alliance with them at this point? He's looking elsewhere for someone who he thinks is going to be more beneficial, more stable for him, and he sees that with Navarre.
Okay, well, I think maybe his distrust of Philip maybe panned out in some aspects. So Berengaria, she is the daughter of Sancho the Sixth, and the sister of future King of Navarre, Sancho the Seventh. Sancho the Seventh is allegedly the tallest monarch of the entire medieval period at 7'3". Is there anything on her height? Is there, what do we know about her?
No, nothing on her height that I can very specifically remember. So her tomb has been excavated a couple of times, and I know that they've examined the skeleton to justify the age that she would have been when she died, to try and pin down her birthday. I don't recall seeing anything about her height, but that doesn't mean it's not out there in an archaeological report somewhere. But nothing to say that she was remarkably tall. I mean, unfortunately, even royal women really suffer from tropes in the chronicles. You know, they're all fair, they're all pretty, they're all, very graceful and modest and well-mannered for the most part. So it's difficult to really know the true Berengaria, but in a sense, she's from Navarre, which is part of modern day Spain. So we could, kind of with broad strokes, expect her to look more Latina than we would expect her to be a blonde, or which is what some people have taken from the meaning of fair, that she would have been blonde and quite pale skinned, or perhaps brunette and pale skinned. Whereas if she's Spanish, we can perhaps expect her to look a little bit more, darker skinned, thicker, darker hair than we would see in someone English, for example. So, yeah, that idea that she just fits the stereotype of a English woman is not quite accurate. But otherwise, we know that she's got quite a few siblings. There's, again, debate in some of the chronicles as to how many brothers and sisters she has. Obviously, we know about Sancho the Seventh. We know about her sister Blanca, who becomes Countess of Champagne. She has a brother, Fernando, who is actually used as a hostage for Richard on the Third Crusade when they're arranging his ransom. So that alliance comes in very usefully there. And she may have had another sister, either Teresa or Constanza, depending on which chronicle you're looking at. So she's got a few siblings knocking around, and we know she spends her early years really between the royal residences of Navarre, but otherwise not a lot else. Unfortunately, medieval childhood is one of those things where we don't get a lot of information unless it's about perhaps kings and princes and so on and how they're raised.
Okay, and so at the end of their marriage, it's my brief understanding that perhaps relations between Richard and Sancho have soured somewhat. Richard's becoming aware of his need to have an heir. There may be some speculation as far as their relationship, or I guess potentially her infertility. And then she doesn't marry again. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about sort of the end of that. How does that all end up? And then what she sort of goes on and does next.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Berengaria is actually someone who really jumps out after she becomes a widow, because, yeah, she makes that decision to not get married again. None of the kings seem particularly interested in doing anything with her. I mean, John comes to the throne and he makes a new alliance with Sancho the Seventh. So there's still that connection there. There's still that realization of it's important to be allies. But neither of them mention Berengaria. She doesn't return to Navarre. So again, Sancho clearly doesn't have any plans for her. She sees no reason to go back home. And no one seems to be vying for her hand either. So whether that's because other people don't see Navarre as that important, or again, she's not seen as a favourable candidate because she's a bit older, because there's not proven fertility, and so forth. And she kind of has these lost years up in between 1199 and 1204, where she disappears a bit from the political arena. We know that she's still trying to get money from England, which she was owed as a widowed queen, and she's not very successful in doing so. But she makes the decision in 1204 to negotiate with Philip, King of France, and she exchanges lands which she had been granted in Normandy, which was part of her marriage allotment. She exchanges those for the city and lordship of Le Mans, and that is where she spends the next 26 years of her life. She rules very effectively as a lord. She does it again as a solo woman, which isn't entirely unusual, but perhaps more noticeable. And she's also very determined. She's very stubborn, I think, actually. You know, we get more of an idea of her character when she's Lord of Le Mans, because she's getting into disputes with the local clergy, with the local bishops, and trying to exact the revenues and rights that she'd owed. But she doesn't entirely shirk away from the political arena either, because she fights for her dower. So this is the land and revenue she was allotted upon marriage. She continues to write to the papacy. So there's 3 popes involved that she writes to while she's Lord. She also is writing to John on a regular basis. The papacy intervene on her behalf with John, with the bishops in England, for example. She then writes to Henry III after John dies in 1216. So it's something she really doesn't let go. Unfortunately, she's still not very successful. She gets granted some of the money in arrears by Henry III in 1225 and 1226, but she never receives her full due from it. But I think the letters we've got around her are interesting because it shows that she doesn't let up. You know, we don't get this great idea of her as an active Queen of England, but we do get a good idea of her as this powerful woman in her own right after Richard's death.
Yeah, and this is something that is, I would say, probably less known, probably because it's uncommon, less common certainly, is a woman being, let's say, governor or ruler, or however you'd like to say it, of the lord of the city. So I'm kind of familiar with how that works when a gentleman is doing it. You know, if there's a problem, he sort of just gets on his horse and, gets out his sword and goes and fixes the problem. How does that work when a woman is doing that? What's sort of like the setup there as far as, cause I'm very familiar with how feudal power was very personal, and how, for the most part, of course, not everybody, but for the most part, the men who were ruling would ride out and enforce their demands themselves a lot of times. So how does that work? Does she maybe have would petition the King of France, or does she maybe just have her own sort of local governors or whatever? Or how does that work for her?
Yeah, so we know that she dispenses justice. So we know that she does hold court. She's involved in legal matters and so on. We know that she has good working relationships with the local lords around her as well, in terms of, again, forming councils to resolve local matters and disputes and so on. So it's perhaps more of an administrative form of governing than we would see with men, for example. We don't have evidence of her, on horseback and going and dealing with matters personally, or being involved in military affairs. We don't see her raising any vassals or armies or anything of that instance, which we do see with other female lords in the medieval period, women who do raise their own vassals and armies. But we don't see that with Berengaria. So whether that's, again, lack of evidence, is something that's really common when it comes to unpicking medieval history in this time period, but also women's history quite often. You don't know if it's an absence of evidence or, evidence of absence. But we do know that she's a very competent, a very involved administrator, and that's how she affects her power as a lord. It's very much done through the legalese side of things, as opposed to power backed by violence. and that kind of authority that we might be used to seeing elsewhere.
Is there any funny or notable anecdotes from that time that maybe would demonstrate some of her little bit of character or her abilities or what she's been up to?
Yeah, I mean, I think she's at loggerheads with Maurice, the Bishop of Le Mans, for most of the latter part of her time in Le Mans, and she's determined to get money from the Cathedral of Le Mans. And Maurice is like, nope, it's the cathedral, it belongs to the bishop, these are my rights and revenues, you can't have them. And it results in Berengaria being excommunicated from the city. So the city of Le Mans placed under interdict as a result of this dispute. And in 1217, she actually has to flee the city and ends up in exile in Storey for a number of months until she reaches a resolution to resolve these matters. And so, the story goes that when they resolve this, she's meant to hand over money to the clergy, but she won't do it herself. She does it behind closed doors, and she hands the money to a servant who then hands it to the servant of the clergy, and so on. So she's really got this idea of her importance and that she doesn't want to be seen as weak. So yeah, determined, passionate, wants to try and get her own way, perhaps isn't always successful in getting her own way, but very prickly about her character as well. Like I say, I think that story that she wouldn't even hand over money personally, and when she's meant to be resolving this dispute's quite entertaining because it just shows that she thinks she's quite important, and doesn't want to be seen as a weak ruler.
And so through that period, does she have a pretty good relationship with Philip Augustus, or what do we know about sort of their workings then?
Yeah, so with Philip, it's interesting. Why does he agree to hold on? Why does he agree to exchange Le Mans with Berengaria? Because he's in control of Normandy at this point. He technically is in control of the area her lands are in. So he doesn't need for her to agree to exchange them. They're in his possession, technically. So I think he sees it as a little bit more of interfering with the Angevins. So he sees Berengaria at that time as another kind of useful asset to have on side. Not that she appears to be particularly disruptive, but it kind of just, dots the I's and crosses the T's and so on in terms of making sure she can't get into disputes with him. And they do continue to have, or at least Berengaria continues to have a good working relationship with the kings of France. We see that she has arrangements with Philip's son, Louis VIII, when she receives a grant of land from him to settle the establishment of her abbey, Le Pau, just on the outskirts of Le Mans. So she does continue to have a good working relationship with them both. And I think Philip Augustus, perhaps where we always focus on English kings, I think he's really not known about as much in kind of in terms of how effective he is as a politician. He's very manipulative, he's very sly, he's very good at playing people off against one another. And I think he will utilise anyone that's available to him to get his own means. And I think there's a little bit of that with Berengaria, but he doesn't push her out, so to speak. He makes her a lord, he treats her as a lord, and they work pretty well together, and she's not a thorn in his side the same way some of the other lords are.
It almost seems to me like a little bit of a personal jab, like I'm going to take my sort of enemy's wife and just give her a job, like I'll treat her nice, like you guys don't want to have anything to do with her. You don't want to give her the money. You don't want to do anything. Like, we'll put her up over here. She'll kind of, she can do her things in the city and I'll show you guys how great she is. It just strikes me a
Yeah.
little bit like that.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like that actually. And just Philip, again, happy to do what he wants to get what he wants, and does a good job at it. And when you're talking about Richard and John and you're thinking, is it because of weak kingship, or is it the fact that Philip is just that good at doing his job? He's, I think, an underrated monarch in some respects because he is so skilled as a soldier and as a politician. But yeah, he gets what he wants in the end. He conquers most of the land back from the Angevins. And obviously, John is left with England in a pretty sorry state during his reign.
Would your take on that be because Philip is so good or because John is so bad?
Oh, I think Philip is very, very good. I think John struggles from a few things. Poor political judgment is one of them. He does also struggle with the fact that Richard has drained the treasury because of the Third Crusade, because of Normandy, and therefore he does inherit a bit of a mess in the first place and just doesn't have the skills to improve it. So I don't think he stood much chance against Philip anyway. If John had some more competency about him, he might have been able to put up the fight for a bit longer. But yeah, I think he suffers a bit because Richard's almost seen as, like the golden boy of history in some respects. He's the Lionheart. He's the one who goes off on crusade, and he's this amazing soldier and so on. And John's just not. He's not a soldier. He's not a fighter. He's, just inept in so many ways, unfortunately.
Yeah, he seems unfortunately also just like a bad administrator. He just kind of like that episode that you mentioned, that I've done here on the podcast. He just strikes me as somebody, even if he had inherited a good situation, it just seems like I don't think he would have known what to do with it. It doesn't seem like I don't know. Everything just sort of went downhill that it's sort of hard to see how he can take anything and run with it from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't handle the Arthur situation very well. He makes the decision when he becomes king to take one of his vassals' betrothed and marry her and make Isabella of Angoulême his wife, which isn't exactly how you want to start off your reign either, by winding up one of your major vassals who's very likely to go running to the King of France if they're upset. So he gets himself off on a bad foot, and I mean, bless her, Eleanor of Aquitaine tries to do so much to secure Aquitaine and to keep everyone on side for him. And I think it's interesting. I mean, she was 82 when she died. She didn't have a lot of legs left in her, but I just wondered how John's reign would have gone if she'd still been around and still trying to mediate things for a bit longer, or if John's reign was always going to play out the way it did because of his skills and personality being what they were.
Yeah, unfortunate. So let's wrap up Berengaria's story a little bit. She went from Princess of Navarre to married to Richard the Lionheart, and then as a widow, and then to the Lord of Le Mans. And so how does that all end for her?
Yeah, I mean, I think she's happy in Le Mans as much as we can ever kind of ascribe emotions to figures of the past. She's settled there. She doesn't need anything else. She needs money on a regular basis. That is something she struggles with, but otherwise she has a pretty settled life. And I mean, she's still remembered very fondly in Le Mans. She's seen as kind of the local heroine. The fact that she chooses to establish an abbey on the outskirts of Le Mans, which is where she chooses to be buried, that shows where her heart was. She didn't want to be sent back to Pamplona, to Navarre, to be buried there. She didn't have the affections of her marital family to be buried at Fontevraud or anywhere else. Le Mans, where she chose to be, and it's where her heart always was, and it's a place that remained very special to her. And like I say, the fact that she's remembered so fondly is just a testament to that, really. She was someone notable to them, so she might not have had all the kind of powers and skills we'd associate with a queen, but as a lord, I think she did a pretty good job of how she administrated, how she governed, how she acted while she was there. even if it brings her into dispute with the church every now and again. But I think most people end up doing that at one point or another.
It seems that most people doing anything sort of ran up against the church a little bit.
Yeah.
Is the abbey that she commissioned, is that still around?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it still survives in very good condition. And they've recently moved her tomb in the last couple of years. So she used to be in quite a hidden away past the choir, and now she's much more visible to where to visitors. But yeah, it's a lovely little abbey. It really is, and it's probably the only place you're going to find all the Berengaria merchandise you could ever want. Because I mean, they have all the candles and the fridge magnets and absolutely everything else with her initials and images of her tomb and so on. So yeah, if people want to go and see her tomb, it's very easy to do so.
What is the abbey called?
Lepo. So L
Lipo.
apostrophe EPAU.
Okay, and so for anybody who wants to check out more, there will be links in the description to Dr. Storey's book. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and what people can expect?
The book is really meant to bring her to life because I think, again, we've spoken about Richard a fair amount in the episode, which is almost inevitable because he's such a larger than life figure. And I wanted to bring Berengaria out of the shadows because, all right, she is a queen who we don't have an awful lot of evidence for, but she's central to so many things. The Third Crusade, the war between England and France. And she goes on to have this fantastic widowhood. And I think that's really important as well, to think about the fact that we do have so many queens, but actually women tend to get more powerful as they get older. And she's a prime example of that. She doesn't retire from politics. She doesn't disappear. She doesn't go into an abbey. She leads a really interesting full life where we get so much more of her personality coming out. And that gives us that idea of what she could have done as queen if she'd had the opportunity. Now, again, whether she doesn't have those opportunities because of her relationship with Richard or because Eleanor of Aquitaine is there and is just such a experienced and trusted ruler, it makes sense for Richard to utilise her. But yeah, I think there's so much more to Berengaria than meets the eye, and I think that the biography does a job of telling that. It shows us what women are outside of being queens as well.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to consider how she's in the middle of this time of so many just giant figures: Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard the Lionheart. So, she maybe seems more quiet by comparison, but I think that's probably almost anybody, because those are just some of the biggest figures of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and I mean, like I say, her predecessors are Eleanor of Aquitaine and Empress Matilda, if you count Empress Matilda as a queen. Those are two big women to follow in the footsteps of. And yeah, like I say, you've got Richard, you've got John. But again, John's wife, Isabella, well, he has two wives, Isabella of Gloucester and Isabella of Angoulême. They kind of get pulled more and more into the shadows as the time goes on. It is a time of big characters, and inevitably those big characters tend to be the men, they tend to be the kings and so on. But I think there's plenty of women doing stuff alongside them and in the background too, and their stories just need to be pulled out into the public eye a bit more so we can see what they're doing.
Fantastic. And how did you get attracted to her story, I guess is the way to put it? How did you, because obviously, I guess as a historian or a scholar, you can sort of study anything. So how did you get put on this?
Yeah, I mean, I started off with Eleanor of Aquitaine, which I think most people, it's got to be Eleanor or Richard, right? Or Henry V if you do a bit later, that kind of ends up drawing you into monarchs in the Middle Ages. And I wanted to do my PhD around her and then got drawn into Empress Matilda. And we were like, right, well, let's look at all these royal women. Let's look at Berengaria and Isabella as well. And I kind of thought like Eleanor would be like my ride or die forever. She's an amazing woman. But I was just really drawn by the fact that Berengaria was so neglected, so just not written about in um, the history books. I'm like, but we've got Richard the Lionheart here. Like, why aren't we talking about his wife? Why don't we know her story? Like, why is this missing? And I think I just became a really passionate defender of her in terms of just people need to know about some of these women more. And she's just, very much a die-hard Berengaria fan at this point. I just wanted to bring her story to life more and more. And that is something I hope I've done. So, all about bringing these people to life in a different way.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. That's actually, even though I'm very into Richard, but I think an even bigger part of my content and stuff that I'm researching and working on is the Italian Normans. And a big part of that is just that their story is so incredible. And I mean, who's heard of William Ironarm? Basically nobody. He's a very underperforming, relative to sort of historical exposure. Or Roger, the Grand Count of Sicily, these guys that, are basically virtual unknowns, it seems like. But their story is so incredible. So I can definitely relate to that, where you're just like, man, this is just a story that people need to hear about. So that's fantastic. For anybody that wants to dig in more, you can check out her book in the description below. And I will leave you with the last word. If you have anything else that you'd like to add about Berengaria or the time period or medieval history generally, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that I've convinced some of you that Berengaria is worth digging into a little bit more and reading about. But I think a big takeaway generally for the period is that go and look at the women, because they are being much more politically active than you might think. It's not just Eleanor of Aquitaine, it's not just Empress Matilda, who are both fab in their own right, but actually you've got all these amazing women, whether they're queens or whether they're noble women, who are very powerful, who rule, who act, who lead armies, who govern. And their stories aren't always the easiest to find, but they are worth finding. I think it's always worth just digging into them a bit more. I mean, when you mention the Italy, like Constance of Sicily is a really interesting woman who I think we don't know a lot about either. And yeah, just pick somewhere, pick a country, pick a place, pick a time period, and you will find some fab women to go and find out about a bit more and how they contribute to society as well.